the problem of employability and others is not only in Uganda. So humanities world over have come under attack, under threat for different reasons. And so increasingly what we have is this negative attitude from the public, and of course because it comes from the public, it comes from those in political leadership, in other leadership, it affects the students. I had someone who said one time that, imagine I thought my son was studying sciences, because this person lives in the US. He said, I thought my son was studying sciences. I've just realized that he's doing the things of women. And I said, what are the things of women? And he said, because he's doing those other subjects for women. I don't know literature, I don't know what, because a real man should do sciences. And I told him that I thought he was joking a lot. That time I was doing my PhD, so he didn't know what I was doing, because he's a Ugandan who works as a casual laborer in the US. So you can imagine somebody who is doing the job of taking care of the elderly in their places, which is a very much appreciated thing to do, telling you that those who are doing humanities are doing things of women. But so what is the problem? So there's that negative attitude. There is diminished funding. In the case of Uganda, we don't even need to labor to explain. We know that the humanities teachers are not paid like the science teachers. We know that when you get to university, that people with science background will most likely get government scholarship if they've passed well. But when it comes to the humanities, we can count the few that would get government scholarship. So maybe you'll have a few going to the law school. Bachelor of Arts in Music, we have, I think, about 5 students that will be sponsored by the government. But most of the courses are not funded. When you talk about the field of research for the established academics, getting research grants in the humanities and arts is a big toll. And so, if you are still at the lower levels, then who wants to go to places where there is no hope? So when you're told, please go this direction, then you take a direction where there is more hope. The shrinking job prospects. But I want to add that the shrinking job prospects are not only in the humanities, because our colleagues under STEM, just the other day on Capital Gang, the minister was saying there are so many doctors on the streets looking for jobs, and the jobs are not there. I'm sure you've also been following the conversation about internship and withdrawal of allowances for internship doctors on internship. And so because of this increasing condemnation, there is also reduction of faculty, people actually growing in those particular disciplines. I was just talking earlier to Professor Jambo, and I told him that I was asked to identify a professor of history in Uganda to review certain documentations, and you might not believe it, we don't know of any at the moment. The one we used to know who was here seemed to have left the academia, maybe again because of the poor pay of, the humanities. And then, then there's also the point that we are not preparing students for clear career paths, okay? Somebody says, I'm doing PCB because my dream is to become a doctor, then I'm going to do medicine and I'll be a doctor, and it's as clear as that. But then for the humanities, what are you doing? The combinations are many I won't mention, and then they will ask you, okay, so what do you project to do in the future? Most people in the humanities will say they want to do law, or they want to do social work, or they want to do journalism and communication. Nobody wants to talk about teaching and other things. And so I wasn't terribly surprised when a question was asked about teaching earlier, and the students were very cold about that. But I want to tell you that, yes, what you aspire is one thing, the reality in the world is another. So it is just good for you to keep your options open. You want to aim highest and get the best, but if it doesn't come, then what happens? just like you all would want lucrative career paths in STEM, but not everybody can get to STEM. And so we are constantly under attack. There are even threats of the arts and humanities being closed or being banned from the curriculum. And these conversations, I think, have gone further down to secondary school as well. And then we are also accused as scholars and practitioners, maybe scholars largely, that we are withdrawn from wider concerns of society, that some of us focus on what we do. I'm a teacher of history, and all I'm doing is history. I don't want to know anything else. So when you ask me about the implication of what I'm doing or how that helps society, I tell you that is not my role. As a historian, my work is to do something else. So these are things that have been pointed to us, that there is a disconnect from what we do. There's a disconnect with the general public. And so because there's a disconnect, and we think, for those of us in the academia, that we should comfortably sit in the ivory tower, then we lose the opportunity where we would have made what we do known to others. And for that matter, I really want to congratulate Kyambogo University for having this special day today where all of us can reflect on these issues. We are also blamed for failing to evolve with society. That things were done in a certain way and they must always be done like that. So history is taught a certain way, or geography is taught a certain way, or religious studies is taught a certain way. So if you try to move away from that, then you're disrupting the field, you're disrupting the discipline. And also we are accused of failing to be innovative. So we teach slave trade. You can talk about the trans-Saharan slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. We can talk about slave trade across the Indian Ocean. But how do we move beyond what we learn about that slave trade and relate that to contemporary issues today? Because now there is a lot of talk about modern slavery. But then how do we use the knowledge that we study about those distant topics to relate to contemporary issues? Of course, that applies to all the disciplines in the humanities. We are also accused of being either trapped in the past or wandering around aimlessly in the wilderness of the future. And I'm saying aimlessly here because some people don't see the sense, the direction in which we are going. And so they think, so you're just around without no clear sense of direction. And that sometimes we also hide under the same tired, old research ideas. Ideas that people worked on in the 50s are the same things that we are still doing today. And so these are things that we have to reflect on. Now, following the conversation so far this morning, and knowing very well that we have both students from the sciences and from the arts, I thought I should, again, the historian in me, give a little bit of history on knowledge. So initially, knowledge was actually unitary, like one, all embodied in the one-word philosophy. And for a long time, the scientists and the philosophers worked together. But we see knowledge evolving and dividing into different branches. So we have the natural sciences, you have the social sciences, and we have the humanities and the arts. And that over the years, the natural scientists began to see themselves as the leaders of invention and innovation. And I think that it is easy to justify that because of the sort of tangible things that they do, which you will actually see when you compare that with what we do in the humanities. Now, in the late 19th century, a disagreement emerged between a literary critic and an evolutionary scientist. And so that sort of marked the beginning of these divisions now between the sciences, or STEMs as we know them today, and then the arts and humanities. And then fast forward, in the mid-20th century, 1959 in particular, British scientist Charles Snow accused the humanities, and he called for prioritizing science teaching in the British education system. So you can see that our president really is not at fault, because this idea has begun long ago. And then he did that because he thought science was more reliable, science was more trustworthy. And my colleagues here who talk about social construction of things and understanding things according to contexts, I think you will see where that was coming from. And he thought that intellectuals, or literary intellectuals, were opposed to progress because of the kind of things that they were doing. Now, the humanities scholars did not take that lying down. So in 1962, Lewis accused Snow of being very ignorant of history, of literature, and history of industrial revolution. He pointed out that science was devoid of humane values. So if science is to be meaningful, then we need to think about the human values. But the point is that the exchange between these particular scholars back then in the mid-20th century really shaped and sharpened the divide between the two fields, the humanities and the sciences. And that is the debate that endures today. Now, of course, one of the key things debated about is the question of relevance and usefulness or uselessness. I want to go back to the quote that I began with. Now, when people began to attack the humanities in the mid-20th century, then humanities scholars began to speak back. And so in 1970, one scholar argued that humanities needed to become relevant, that we can't just be teaching for the sake of teaching. We can't just be reading and producing knowledge for the sake of producing knowledge, but rather that knowledge should be relevant to both our students that we are teaching and society. So that was one position. But over the years, other conversations emerged. So Ikipe, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Botswana, argues that actually the problem was not with the humanities, and that the humanities are not on the decline, but rather that the problem is with society and the kind of demands that society makes on us. And he cautioned that if we change the humanities to match the demands of the marketplace, then we shall be doing a disservice to our disciplines. And I think that is where some of us find ourselves. You're saying, yes, society is evolving, yes, but there are these key tenets of the discipline which I don't want to ignore and get lost in something else. Now, several universities on the continent, I think, tried to follow what would be Ekipe's, the kind of comment that Ekipe makes. So when they said, okay, now we are going to go with the demands of society, we are going to go with the changing dynamics, and we need to revise our curriculum and include aspects of near vocational education so that we are speaking to the needs of society. And here I'm thinking about Makerere University, for example, when they introduced Bachelor of Arts in Secretarial Studies and introduced a couple of other courses within the Faculty of Arts back then in the 90s so that they could make the programs more marketable. They were accused of becoming scholars in the marketplace. because you are looking for customers. So everybody is trying to do what they want to do in order to get customers. So we are all scholars in the marketplace, and we are grappling, we are fighting over customers that we can get. Of course, the increasing number of universities in the country did not make things any better, because there is more demand, there are more opportunities, and so students can go elsewhere. So for Equipe, the argument was that yes, we need to engage with society, but let's be mindful of our disciplines. So it is good to speak GIS, but you don't forget the field of geography as a field. But there are also conservatives. So I've talked about those who said we needed to become relevant. There are those who said, well, but we need to be careful. But there are also conservatives who argue that actually we in the humanities and arts do not need to prove our relevance, because humanities have always been part of higher education. So those who don't know our relevance, it is up to them, but this is our position and we are not going anywhere. And so that is the point at which then I ask, as scholars, as practitioners, as administrators, do we simply sit back and believe that because the humanities will always exist at the university, because they are our birthright, therefore we should not do anything? These are questions I'm inviting you to think through with me. In a challenging world of today, where things are evolving very fast, do we take our role for granted? And I think that available evidence suggests otherwise. And that is why we are having this conversation. That is why we need to reflect on the things together with the students who have not yet joined university. Now in 2020, Laura McClary, kind of agreeing with the scholar Muller, pointed out that the relevance of the humanities is influenced by numerous factors, including economics and changing social, political, and cultural norms and expectations. And I think a lot has been talked about that by the other presenters. Now, what can we do? And here again, this has been talked about. I think one of the things we can do is to build bridges, rather than emphasize the divide between the disciplines. We need to build the bridges and see how to work together. We need a cultural shift where we get to see the humanities as being integral to an ethical, value-based orientation in all disciplines. And here, I think my message really goes to us in education, in administration. How do we ensure that the humanities are actually cutting across the different programs that we have in the universities? We need to reach out and demonstrate the centrality of humanities to everybody, especially if we expect that our future doctors, engineers, politicians, scientists, and all of us here are to be ethical practitioners. So now there is one thing, you being an ethical person, and of course it's another teaching you about ethics. But we think that a person with an open mind and willing to learn, and a person who is conscious, constantly remember, but that when I was a student, my professor told me never to do this. And that constantly reminds me I don't think I should take the risk. We need to think about collaboration with others. We need to innovatively teach our core courses. And we need to constantly encourage students to reflect on the relevance of the humanities. So now I teach history, and one of the questions I ask my students at the end of each semester is to tell me what they have learned in that course, other than the content. What is it that they have learned, the soft skills?